when we talk about speech perception, let's say, right? So speech, automatically you think about, well, it's really an auditory sort of signal. Speech perception has a lot of relationship with how do you see as well. For example, how do you observe the gestures of the speaker?
Welcome to Zen-Brain. Now this 1.5 kilogram structure is why we exist. It's the machine that helps us navigate the world. What we see, hear, smell, taste and touch. But it's also a place where our thoughts originate and decisions are made, where our memories are stored, where we imagine things and how we decide to love, hate, fight and fear. Our brain basically decides how we perceive the world. It forms our individual reality. Remember, individual reality. What you see is different from what I see. No matter what it is that we talk about on Zen-Brain, whether it's depression, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental illness, overcoming odds, losing weight, changing your life, it all originates here first, in the brain. And we just don't seem to talk enough about the brain. And we must. That's what we at Zen-Brain are going to do. Talk a lot about this human computer in a simple way that all of us understand. What you feed into this complex brain matters. And don't forget, you can rewire. We all can rewire our brains. We'll tell you how. I can talk about it at length, but it wouldn't matter. But it matters when a scientist from the National Brain Research Center tells us so. Dr. Arpan Banerjee is part of the Cognitive Brain Dynamics Lab and is researching how neural networks coordinate and communicate with each other uniquely in each one of us, which is why we have different behavior patterns. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Arpan Banerjee.
Good afternoon.
Let's begin with an obvious question about our five senses. We see through our eyes, hear with our ears, smell with our noses, taste with our tongue, touch with our hands. What is the role of the brain in all this?
That's a great question, actually. And because we learn about the five senses for a lot of the time in our school biology textbooks, and you remember those figures of eyes, retina, ears from your high school textbook, and that some of us feared biology because of that, right? The gory details of what each subdivisions of the retina are. Let's shift the language slightly. You can think about the environment as throwing you some signals, and the sense organs convert these signals to some sort of a, for the time being, you can think of a telegraphic Morse code, like ones and zeros, like a telegraphic code. Code actually what the brain is actually seeing, because the brain cannot see the actual image outside. So for example, my brain cannot really see you. So the retina actually has a map of you in the retina itself, which has been now converted into some Morse code kind of signals, and that goes and reaches my brain. Now what happens is in the auditory cortex as well, or in the auditory system as well, when the sound falls on the ears, similarly the similar kind of codes are generated by your ears, the neurons in your ears, and that sends to the brain again. And similarly for nose, you can have the chemicals which are the odorants. They are falling on your certain kind of cells or receptors, and then again some kind of a code that is going into the brain. Now I don't remember you, or you don't remember me as a separate image or my sound to be separate. You remember me as a complete whole. So you can think of the brain as doing something which is essentially inherently integrative, where every senses or the information, the codes from each one of these senses are being mishmashed into some kind of a common signal. But somewhere down the line, you can think of the two basic fundamental properties. One is you take a code and just do nothing and sit with it, right? Or you can take the code and do something with it. So in a sense, you process the code. You try to understand the code, what the code means. So a lot of these brain areas should do both. It should code and as well as understand, or rather decode this code to understand, unravel what is the real thing underlying. So in a way that anything, a kind of a representation of our world, the way we see it, or sort of, see the movie Matrix, for example, like everything is generated by these electrical circuits in the brain. So what your brain areas are talking to each other are doing ultimately gives you a representation of the world around us.
And that brings us to how we perceive the world, really. And our perception of what we see and the meaning that we assign to something is unique to us. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So as you can imagine, right, perception itself, like the way you see, for example, the way you see the color red is different, right? So, for example, my wife, I think she sees a lot more colors than me. Similarly, for example, some people feel the glass of wine is full-bodied, or some people don't figure any difference between cheap wine and expensive wine, for example, right? For them, it's the same thing. So similarly, it's a matter of individual perception, right? Everything really, it is dependent on how you learn to perceive, how we process perception, or what do we perceive. We are now talking about something which is very individual specific by even the definition or the construction. So automatically the question can be raised that how do the brain itself does this processing? And that's kind of one of the main goals of our lab. We want to understand how our main hypothesis is that the way the neurons are coordinating amongst each other, how they are talking to each other, is ultimately guiding this individual specific perception. So, for example, the signaling between each brain area which is relevant, right? For example, talking about vision, audition, we were talking about earlier, the five senses. Variability in the signaling among these areas will ultimately control your perception.
I love the analogy that, when we were talking earlier, you gave, which is that of an orchestra, really. Right. So you do have individual instruments, but ultimately it's about the orchestra coming together and really performing.
Right. When you perceive the music, you sort of don't remember each one of the instrument as sounding separately and the sound of each instrument separately, right? You remember the whole orchestra, whether that was having a melody, whether that is pleasant, whether that is soulful, So similarly, but there can be certain instances when somebody is playing solo, for example, one of the instrument is going solo, or the vocalist is suddenly doing their thing. So there are instances when something gets disengaged from the rest of the whole, but other times, mostly it is the whole that you really care about. So our brain also, as our perception requires, it kind of goes to these different states where it either sort of acts as a whole, or it can also act as a very sort of segregated individual, right? So with its own idiosyncrasies and whatnot. So yeah, so I also like that analogy of the orchestra, by the way. Yeah.
And that's exactly what you are researching.
Absolutely.
How these neural networks really communicate with each other. Now, speaking about this multisensory perception, you carried out an experiment that was recently published in the European Journal of Neuroscience. Tell us a little bit about that.
When we talk about speech perception, let's say, right? So speech, automatically you think about, well, it's really an auditory sort of signal. Speech perception has a lot of relationship with how do you see as well. For example, how do you observe the gestures of the speaker? Because speech is not a isolated thing about the sound. Well, the sound also has emotions. For example, when we are actually understanding someone speaking to us, we also try to understand how, from their gestures at least, what is the emotion which they are speaking to us. So we are actually attending to their visual stimuli. So long back around in the 1970s, a lot of interest was there in speech perception from the computer science community. And a couple of computer scientists actually proposed an experiment in which you can trick a person. So they were kind of merging sounds with lip movements and doing their things of playing with the editing. And they figured out that sometimes when certain things can be played in a certain way, you tend to perceive something which is not in the environment. So this is called this McGurk illusion. So where I can show you a demo. So Shruti, what I would like you to sort of hear first is I would play you a video, and I would want you to sort of report to me after I play the video. What did you hear?
Okay. So I'm going to put on my headphones.
Pa, pa, pa.
So did you hear it?
Yes, I heard tha, tha, tha.
Yeah, that's correct. Let's do this again. So let me mute the video.
Ka, ka,
That's correct. So now what I would go do is I will actually ask you to close your eyes and listen to this.
Pa, pa, pa.
Pa, pa.
Yeah, that's right. So that's kind of pretty weird, isn't it?
All our lives
Sorry?
we thought speech is all about listening, and it's just thrown me off.
Right. So what we have done here is we have superimposed as you can figure out, the lip movement of ka with the sound of fa, and what it gives you is an illusion of tha. We are not the ones who discovered it; it was discovered before. But what is not known about is what is the underlying network principles, or how do our brain areas coordinate amongst each other when we are perceiving this illusion. So one of the hypotheses here is that sound will be computed by certain centers of the brain, such as the auditory cortex, and the vision will be processed by certain structures, such as the visual cortex. And finally, there are certain areas called these multisensory areas who are involved in processing this illusion. Now, what we ask is something different. We ask the question that how do the communication among these areas are changing when you are actually perceiving the illusions? In kind of people who tend to hear it more. And believe it or not, if I repeat this experiment 100 times in different individuals, 60% of people will report they have sort of got the illusion, and 40% or slightly less maybe report that they have not got the illusion. So you can clearly see, that whole color of redness of red. So this is same thing kind of creeping up. There is an individual specific effect of this illusion as well. So the question that we want to understand is that, or we asked, is how do the networks or the brain networks communicate amongst each other when you are perceiving this illusion or when you are not, right? So for that we did an Eeg experiment, and the Eeg is something similar, which stands for electroencephalogram. You can think about ECG, which a lot of people are familiar with, which actually measures signals from the heart. You can think about the ECG sort of electrodes or the sensors are now placed in your head, and you can actually measure the electric signals from your brain, which are coming deep inside. It's not going to give you exact measure of the cells inside the brain, but roughly speaking, it reads out the activity of thousands of cells kind of getting activated together. In other words, it gives you the activity of the large-scale network, but it does give you at a very fine temporal scales. So the real temporal scales in which information processing occurs in the brain. Or so, as of one of my sort of known scientists whom I admire, he used to call it the speed of thought. The thing that we found out is there is a particular rhythm in which all this sort of communication gets operational. So if you think about the rhythm in terms of frequencies, this frequency is exactly around at 10 hertz, which we also call the alpha rhythm, and it's the most dominant rhythm in kind of your brain when you are in a resting state. It turns out that people who tend to perceive the stimuli more, communication in this alpha rhythm seems to abruptly go down, right? So for example, if you think about, there is a network which is talking to each other in a particular frequency, exactly like like some sort of a code is going among this network, exchange among this network. So suddenly the stimuli comes, and that code sort of communication is broken down, particularly for people who are actually perceiving the illusion. For people who are not perceiving the illusion, for people who are perceiving the auditory sort of sound, they don't seem to have that major disruption of the alpha communication. In one way, this is about the first time, I think one of the first times, we are actually getting a neuromarker of something operational at the very large scale network level, communication, which is changing as a function of individual specific perception.
Doc, just to break that down simply for our viewers, is that there are people who hear different things as well, right? From what we have just heard.
Pa, pa, pa.
So for example, you take the case of autistic children or children who are having neurodevelopmental disorders. So when this experiment was repeated on the group of children like that, so they don't seem to perceive the illusion, for example, right? So they perceive it very less number of times. So one of the hypotheses can be the basal sort of networks or the communication that is going on in the alpha frequency range is very strong in these participants, right? And they are not able to disengage, or in a way, how their attention system works. Their attention system should work, if it is actually working efficiently, should be able to disengage this network, right? So in a way that our perception is really about something that is oncoming stimulus to us is kind of based on this disengagement of network. So this is what we are getting at. So in a way, we can explain different kinds of way people are responding, not only to autism per se, but also different kinds of mental health sort of situations, how people are perceiving the things differently. For example, the simplest possible example, a sort of scene which is comic for someone in a movie is maybe something not so comic to you at all, right? So, and similarly, for something which is tragic for somebody is not tragic to you at all. So all these individual variations are very important of who we are as an individual, and really brings out this uniqueness among us. And this uniqueness, you can say, ask the question, where is it coming from? Well, that can come from different elements. How we learn, who our teachers were, who our caregivers were when we were young, what your sort of mother ate when somebody was having you as a kid, right? So all kind of things, nutrition of the mother, all these can be relevant for developing in this kind of senses and all that. So we don't exactly know, right? So those details of those processes, but what we do know is that it's really a complex system in the end of the day, where individual idiosyncrasies are shaped up by various factors, and really you cannot identify one person as in a group or something, right? So there's one saying in the autistic literature, like people who study autism, if you see one autistic kid, you have seen one autistic kid, right? Because everybody is different. So that is not, and as such, if you can see in the normal or maybe the typically developing adults or us, for example, right? We are also different, right? Every one of us has a perceptual process which is different.
And on a philosophical level, this is something that I think all parents should understand, is that their children is unique and there's no need to compare, because that child may have qualities that somebody else doesn't, right? That's how our brain functions. This is actually an amazing analogy, really. So it's not what one part of the brain perceives, but how the networks communicate with each other.
Absolutely.
Doc, you spoke about disengagement. Tell us what this is all about.
You raised the issue of the philosophy, uniqueness. So philosophically speaking, people who are interested in consciousness research, they talk about something called qualia, right? So everything we perceive has some inherent quale to it, which means that it is subjectively unique to each one of us. What we are seeing, at least in our study, that the disengagement is equally important to engagement. Why do I say that? So earlier studies in the EEG literature, for example, have sort of showcased when brain comes to synchrony, that becomes very relevant for information processing. And this has been sort of reported in studies where people did EEG on monks, for example, who was practicing Buddhism, and they saw higher power of gamma rhythms in these monks. So in a way, they related the synchrony to altered states or sort of consciousness in a way. So what we are saying, synchrony is not the only part of the puzzle. So there is this other part of the puzzle, is how do you really disengage from an existing state? Because the way we disengage has a lot to say about how do we rather engage or form new states. For example, epileptic seizures. That's perhaps the only sort of state of the brain where the entire brain is fully synchronous. For example, all activity, if you look at one activity in one brain, that is reflective of activity from very far away parts of the brain. So everything is in complete sync. But that's not good, right? Really, the way to go is this whole notion of fractured synchrony. To summarize again, that the way we disengage between the two nodes of a network is as important as an engagement. And in a real life situation, this also makes sense. For example, If you think about it, if you can't disengage from the work stress that you have, you won't be productive the next day. So the disengagement is a very, if you think about it from the conservation of energy as well, you need these states of disengagement so that the network can actually process something else, something new, something creative. In that sense, this is indeed something that we want to sort of look for in our future studies in different areas. For example, maybe in the patients, for example, of mental health, where we can find this disengagement, engagement, relationships are broken. So this is something like one of the hypotheses we are carrying forward from this study to our series of the next studies.
So when people are asked to pursue hobbies as a distraction, what you are actually doing is disengaging from perhaps the stress that you are undergoing, and scientifically you're explaining that as a disengagement of sort, something that will help you re-engage.
Absolutely.
This is something that came up in one of our chats, and I was fascinated by it, about why we remember certain things during the day and why we don't. It's completely stuck with me what you said, and I want viewers of Zen-Brain to really hear it from you. Why is it that we remember certain things, and why is it that we forget other things?
So one of the sort of way at least scientists are trying to sort of see how we remember things is that, we go on this engagement, disengagement process as we sort of see in our experiment throughout the day. And then we get to sleep. The brain now has a movie. Zen-Brain, for example, has shot some movie over the entire day of whatever happened. And then when you sleep, that movie is replayed, right? So the movie is replayed in terms of sequences. And there are certain sequences which didn't match maybe the prior expectation of what is the brain sets up in that day to happen. There is a mismatch of this, right? Those are the episodes that get consolidated. So in a way, the idea is that there is some kind of a predictive process. So every living being is trying to predict, because without prediction, we don't survive. In an unconscious fashion also the brain predicts, right, what it is going to see, the next instance of time or whatnot. So when we sleep, this mismatch or matching of these predictions occur. So for example, if we have a sort of, some things which needs to be remembered, the brain said, oh, this didn't match my memory of something that should have happened. Oh, I should remember this might be important. So we need this filtering scheme, because otherwise you can imagine, right, if you shoot all these movies every day, your hard drive space is going to be occupied, right? So you have to kind of, in a way, remember only the critical stuff that, is important.
Something that doesn't fall according to what your brain is predicting is what you remember. It disengages with the usual and picks up and stores it in your memory. One of the things on Zen-Brain, we've been saying it over and over again, is that you can rewire your brain at any time, at any age, at any stage. But I want you to tell us scientifically, because it's one thing for me to say it, but when a scientist says that, then more people listen. So tell us how this concept of rewiring, how can we rewire ourselves?
So one of the main thing there is that use it or lose it. So the more you keep engaged to the stuff that you want to do, you want to be good at, is something, and then again it goes back to your learn and then relearn every day. So in a way that you have to have that sense of unlearning, you have to have the sense of disengagement. How do you add new things as you go along? And this is what we talk about is cognitive flexibility. So for example, in a recent study where we looked at aging at a large cohort of 650 individuals, and the data came from Cambridge Aging Neuroscience Group, where they have recorded these individuals over from 18 to 88 years of age with same sort of males and females and all sort of controls. And these are perfectly healthy individuals. They don't have any comorbid disorders or anything. And what we found out, the alpha rhythms of the elderly individuals slows down. So there is a shift of about 2 Hz in their alpha rhythms. Associated with that is also a decrease in communication between the nodes in the alpha rhythm. And as well as there is an increase on the other hand in the lower frequencies in the theta rhythm. So if you, for example, think about the theta rhythm is one of the sort of rhythms which is very relevant for consolidating our long-term memory. For example, in the hippocampus, it is very relevant. So what gets stored? Earlier you were asking the question, what gets stored, what gets not? So people have shown that the phase of the theta rhythm decides what gets stored, what gets not, right? So, so this theta rhythm has actually turned out to be a lot more in terms of power and, you know, coherence is the scientific term for that. Is this communication is more in these elderly individuals, meaning as we grow old, we become wiser. I mean, that's not surprising. There is a saying, right? Older and wiser. On the other hand, you have other features like, you know, doing an eye-hand coordination task. That decreases. Otherwise, Sachin Tendulkar would have played till he was 60, right? He had to retire because those reflex actions actually got sort of decreased. But as you see over his career, for example, once he got older, he was able to control himself much better in playing the way that he wants and that is more meaningful to the team. Healthy aging is way that how the brain can become more wiser.
And that's why people say, if you want to learn something, you've got to practice and keep practicing it. Literally put yourself in that situation, because it's only then that when neurons fire together, they will wire together. Rewiring yourself. If you want to change something, put yourself in that situation, learn something new, and keep at it till your neural networks actually develop and become stronger with practice.
There were also some studies a few years back which actually looked at people with Alzheimer's disease, and one of the ways that was suggested is exercise on treadmill. And this is not heavy exercise, right? So this is just regular walking on treadmill. 15 minutes of that, and it turns out that if they do it every day, there is a reversal of this disease, so which the drugs can't affect. At least if the onset or the progression can be a little bit arrested with exercise, regular exercise, and people have shown that. Physical exercise can also play a big role in how you sort of retrain these networks. So, and as well as, you know, that healthy habits like eating well and eating in a balance, all these, and having a healthy lifestyle, all this makes a big difference. And then how do you disengage yourself, which we had an elaborate conversation on. All this ultimately can actually come back to your original point of how do we relearn and how do we unlearn, and all these things get affected by, or affects this process.
Well, I'm glad you brought up exercising. That's the reason why people say, go out there and exercise, eat healthy, because it's not just about what you're putting in the stomach. It also affects your brain. One last word from you.
Maybe some of these can be people who are meditating, maybe something which works. And there is another important thing here, right? There is no one way that fits all. A lot of it is dependent on our genes too. So which we know right now today, when we are talking about unlearning, relearning, a lot of this is impacted by genes. For example, kid with a Down syndrome will have real challenges in kind of relearning or anyway the modes of communication of learning. So there are some structural or this kind of genetic constraint which also is posed by nature to us. The genes do have some constraints, but you can work around that up to a certain extent.
Genes play a very, very important role. This discussion has sort of reiterated that fact that one size does not fit all. Our brains are wired differently. We perceive the world differently, and that's why we behave differently. On that note, thank you, Dr. Banerjee, very much for joining me on Zen-Brain. We hope to have you back very soon to talk a little bit more about what this supercomputer is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shruti. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you.